Hey everyone, welcome to episode 71 with Chloe Combi. I'm your host, Stelios. That feels really weird saying that, like I'm a game show host, but I'm not. So, in this episode we talk about COVID. As you can imagine, no one's really been talking about that recently, so we thought we'd cover it. Chloe is probably one of the biggest experts on Generation Z. She has spoken to enough of them writing her book, which is also called Gen Z. I really think we all need to understand the next generation coming into the workforce. It's got to be beneficial. We can't just act like we're bigger or better than them and act like, this generation don't care. I think we really need to get our heads around what it's going to be like working with this generation. I'd recommend you buy her book, but also watch her videos on YouTube. I think this was an all-round great conversation, and I genuinely learnt a lot from Chloe. As you know, this has been a pretty busy week. I guess everyone in hospitality is pretty happy with the measures that Rishi Sunak has put in place. I, for one, welcome them all, and I wish everyone the best of luck during these tough times. We have written a summary on our website, worldofceres.com. If you aren't too sure what they are, go ahead and have a look. On to this episode with Chloe Combi. I hope you enjoy. Chloe Combi, welcome to the Ceres podcast.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, great, thank you. You know, it was as good as we can be with all this craziness going off around us. How are you?
I'm fine. I mean, in some ways, my work hasn't been that affected because, it can be sort of done remotely. And in some ways, it's been really affected because obviously for my work, I travel a lot. So it's kind of, it's been, I guess I've tried to make it like as interesting a time as I can and tried to sort of be, I guess, reflective on the kind of imposed circumstances that you kind of are outside of our control, which has kind of been interesting in a way. But I'm definitely ready for a sort of normal life resuming.
That'll be nice, won't it?
It will. And it's just, I think all those things that, we kind of took for granted, particularly, I think, in lieu of today pertaining to sort of food and drink and going out, that all those things that we just never really gave a second thought to, I think everyone's realised how important they are.
Do you think we'll ever get back to a normal situation, do you think?
I think a lot. I mean, this is when you kind of realise that, assuming that kind of, I guess everyone goes through life assuming that like a government is a government and I think a lot of people genuinely, particularly recently, feel like whoever they vote for, it doesn't matter. And, for want of a better way, sort of, voting for the same thing just by a different name. And I think that this pandemic has really highlighted the fact that government does matter because the responses in different countries have been absolutely stark. And if when you go to Scandinavia or France or Germany, where the response was very quick and very swift and very organized, they've had this, incredible control of the virus, and they've just resumed normal life. I think that they're going at it cautiously, but theatre is going back and cinema is going back, and all those things that feel like very distant way for other countries. Whereas I think countries, and we definitely fall into that haven't had a good plan and didn't respond very quickly, are really suffering the effects now. So not to get too political, but it does really make you, I think, realise that, the people in control really do matter. And it's felt like it's really, I think, distinguished good governments from bad governments, or probably a better way to put it is good leadership from bad leadership.
Interesting you should mention that, because I was listening to be devil's advocate a little bit here, I was listening to a Tim Harford, it's an economics podcast on the BBC yesterday, and they were going through all the data. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't in defense of the government. It was a bit of both. They looked at all the economical data. And they said one thing that was pretty stark is that almost every other country that had COVID had it in one place. And in the UK, it happened in like 5, maybe 6 different cities at exactly the same time. And they said no one had it at that unprecedented scale. Not to say that they couldn't have locked down the airports and everything sooner. It was unprecedented in the fact that UK had it in 6 places, where, let's say, China had it in 1, Italy had it in 1. So I'm not defending the government. I'm just using what they were saying as an argument.
I wonder, but I've thought about that, and I wonder, one of the theories that I have is that because we're this might not be right, but I think because we're such a small country, that I think that we are, the way we work and, the way our kind of families are structured, that I think we move around quite a lot because there isn't that kind of challenge of size. And we are a kind of a multicultural country, so we often have kind of families scattered all around, and there's a really significant difference between kind of urban and suburban and the sort of country and the cities. Whereas if you go to, for example, America's a really good example, because I've worked a lot in America, because it's so huge that generally people tend to stay in the same place, and yes, they go away for holidays, even though they don't have very many holidays. They might go away for a weekend, or maybe they, if they're wealthy, they have kind of houses in the sort of the countryside of the Berkshires, wherever it is. But I think that they tend to sort of remain more in one place, just because of the sheer scale of the place, and everything's so much further away that it takes much longer. Whereas here, it does feel like because it's small, people do move around quite a lot. I might be wrong there, but I wonder whether that has something to do with it.
I do think the population density definitely has something to do with it. I think the UK, whatever you say, is a small island and it's getting cramped. And I think then you've got shorter distances between places, like you say. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't know. But you can only argue that is not going to go in our favour. I think, I saw how Germany did so, again, really great with it. But their population density, I was listening to a scientist talk about it in Germany, and they were saying one of the biggest things that's wrong is that everyone's pitching the death toll as a competition. Germany did well. Oh, such and such did well. And they're saying, we don't look at it like that. We just got scared, so we locked down. She said that I think she said not one of their cities even matches the population density of one of the UK's. They have a lot less people and a lot more space in between, so a lot more rural areas. I think it's unfair to only look at the death metric. You could argue that we've never been through this before, and let's hope if it ever happens again, when we don't tolerate it, it's that next time round they're on top of it straight away. I
think that's true, and I think what it was a weird. I mean, our press is very strange, and I think it loves hysteria and it loves the headline. For obvious reasons. I mean, headlines mean lots of clicks, which means lots of money. But I do think that they like, going for the kind of really hyperbolic headline. And obviously kind of a very grim, dramatic sort of death count, though it's obviously terrible for the population. It's probably, a gift to newspaper editors. And I don't think that in lots of countries, the media has the same relationship that they do in the UK, which is in some ways, designed to kind of whip people up. And I think that's a very American thing. I think, I think there's a lot of parallels between the English and UK press. And it is very sort of responsive, knee-jerk, designed to really provoke a kind of reaction. It tends to be very binary. You have people watch news according to their kind of own sort of ideological or political kind of perspectives. And I think when you go to Europe, it's much more level. And I feel like in a lot of ways, the reaction in the UK was kind of responding to, in some ways, the media coverage. And certainly in America, where you have the absolute, I mean, there's lots of sort of powerful news stations, but obviously by far the most dominant one is Fox News. And obviously we have this strange relationship with the government. And because they were insisting so deep into the sort of pandemic that everything was fine and it was a liberal conspiracy, they were really slow. So again, it's really a really interesting study, I think, in the way we really do sort of seem to reflect the media as well. And it's this weird sort of almost trifecta. You've got government, media and society. And I think in some ways this has really highlighted how that relationship can be quite unhealthy.
The news, especially in this country and America, like you say, they're happy to eat themselves up constantly. They're happy to contradict themselves. They're happy to set fire on things. They've got no issue. They've kept us all whipped up over Brexit for how long? Then they had COVID, and now they've got BLM, and they're throwing it all in the fire. And I do wonder, like, are they shooting themselves in the face? And I do find that sometimes in this country, I was saying to a friend recently, I find that there is a lack of, everyone's got these causes, and that's great. Obviously, causes are amazing, but there is a lack of patriotism. Like, I don't think, how do you explain it? There's not a lot of Britishness sometimes. Like, I think some people are very quick to sort of pee on that fire, if you get what I mean. And I think it'd be nice to say, yes, we've got these causes because we want Britain to be a better place. But that sort of falls on the backfire, if you get what I mean.
No, absolutely. I think you're right.
I think most people might be thinking, wow, why Stelios got Chloe on? What's this got to do with hospitality and so on? But I really think there's a big link between what you talk about and write about and hospitality. And that, in my view, that's because a hospitality job is probably the first job for any teenager, not just Generation Z. I guess anyone that's coming through, the first place they go to is a local restaurant, local hotel, McDonald's, so on and so on. If you could tell us a little bit about, your book and how you come about writing about Generation Z.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I will say there's a huge link, I think, between young people, what we're sort of now kind of referring to Generation Z, and actually starting to look at Generation A. And just in case people aren't sure, I put Generation Z in the 12 to 24 category, and I think Generation A fall into the 2 to 12 category, and then you've got the millennials, which are older than Gen Z, who kind of fall into the 25 to 38, 39 category, even though there's some debate over that, depending on who you speak to. But I think that those sort of reflect the generations quite well. And I mean, my background was much more in education and politics, and I started writing a lot for kind of the media, the thing we were just talking about kind of about teenage life. And I think that maybe the less spoken about aspects. And I think like my work was really interesting because it wasn't doing that thing I think that lots of the media and columnists do, where they like go and speak to their own kids, or they read about something on Twitter and then kind of like anoint themselves as experts. Mine really came from very, very rigorous research, in the mix with kids looking, and so that's kind of how it started. And then with the book Generation Z, and I'm now kind of doing the next two books actually, and doing a sort of a show on it. But I interviewed about sort of 4,000 members of Gen Z over 3 years, so it was a really extensive look into that generation. And I think I was kind of first, because people up to that point, when I started around sort of really researching around about, I guess it was about 2013, 14. And I, before that, like much earlier on, had been sort of writing about them, and it was really interesting because it was kind of revelatory, because I think what it quickly realized was how different the world was, driven by all kinds of factors, whether it was kind of like, sort of technology, or the way that sort of Generation Z, which was becoming very clear, were behaving in a very sort of counterintuitive way, I guess, to almost how we expect teenagers to. So the book started sort of coming together. And my thought at first, which it was going to be a really interesting book from kind of a sociological or political point of view, which it absolutely was. But then what sort of became apparent was, because there was all this very in-depth data, and it didn't stop when Generation Z got published, because I was immediately going into all these other things. So and if anything, it's even broader now. I mean, I have thousands and thousands and thousands of interviews, and even more of kind of data sets, that it was really interesting for kind of brands and industries, because there's this whole snapshot of a generation and about their kind of behavior and their tastes and their wants and their likes and their dislikes. So it became very valuable to industries, all kinds of industries, including the hospitality industry. But I think the interesting thing for kind of the hospitality and drink and food industry was that Generation Z, and this is whether they were an employee or a consumer, were behaving in very counterintuitive ways to the way people, and particularly the industry, had come to expect young people to behave. So, for example, a really big one, which obviously massively hit the hospitality industry, was that not just the decline, but almost a decimation of drinking. with young people. That traditionally, young people, older teenagers, early 20s were very, even, you know, we're not supposed to say so, but younger teenagers were very boozy. It was an age where you experimented with booze, you tried to get into pubs. It was a real right, you know, when you could get into pubs, it was a massive rite of passage, and it became this real centre point to your social life. And that completely fell away with Generation Z. I mean, I think it's now over a third of 18 to 24-year-olds are kind of completely teetotal. Huge numbers of them drink in a very sort of limited way. Vast numbers of them don't go to pubs at all on a regular basis, whereas like millennials and Gen X's would have at far greater numbers. Their food habits and tastes have completely changed. The economic makeup of Generation Z is really, really precarious, which impacts all industries. And I think what it left the whole industry was kind of scratching their heads, because they were expecting, I guess, because everything moves in cycles, and like every year you have this almost like this new generation coming into buying alcohol, going to pubs, going to restaurants, and that kind of thing, and it just wasn't happening. So it sort of became, I think, a real interesting focal point for the industry.
Initially, how do you think the media companies, the Nikes, the Adidases, the alcoholic beverage companies, how do you think they sort of dealt with it? Have they caught up with that?
They didn't deal with it well at all, because I think what they did was they first of all, basically, I think brands came to assume that all generations would basically end up mirroring the same habits and the same tastes. So they never really changed their methodology, and they never really changed their approach. And what happened with Generation Z, I mean, think about how much things have changed in the last 5 years in every possible way, whether it's what we find funny, what we find acceptable, the language we use, how we communicate, how we travel, how we eat, you know, all of those things, whether you think about it from like the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, which have completely kind of shifted, for example, how we sort of view kind of like, say, for example, what we find funny or outwork behaviour or the language you use or how we dress. So that's massive behavioural changes. And then if you think about in terms of like kind of ideologies and, you know, kind of ways we approach the world. Like, so for example, in 2008, which was, so the sort of 12 years that passed since 2008, in 2008, there was a massive economic crash, and that heavily impacted the early lives of sort of millennials, and that kind of sort of changed their behaviour. And in a sense, in that sort of 12 years when sort of millennials have gotten older and Generation Z have sort of come to pass, the world has changed so much in every possible way. And I simply don't think that brands, companies, industries caught up with those things or were really prepared for them. And I think there was almost in the last maybe decade, there's been this kind of panic sort of striving to kind of, I guess, correct themselves and figure out who this generation are and who these consumers are. And I still don't think they're completely there. But no, to answer your question, I don't think that they were prepared at all, simply because they just didn't evolve quickly enough and they didn't realise how quickly and how much things were changing.
Is it possible to keep up, though? Like, you know, everything changes so fast. What was all right yesterday is not today. The social media, the aspect of everyone's got an iPhone in their hand or an Android, whatever. Like, it's such a fast moving world, and you can't. How can you keep nimble and with it?
I don't think you can, is the answer. And I think that you would give yourself 20 heart attacks a day, sort of relatively speaking, because as you say, things do change so quickly. But that doesn't mean that you can't be kind of fluid and you can't be nimble. And I think what the key thing is really is that you have to have a kind of almost like a broader perspective, and you have to have a really good grip on what is going on around you. And the question I think any brand has to ask themselves is not, am I relevant or am I moving day to day? But do I hold a mirror up? Do I reflect the very fast changing and diverse nature of the world? And absolutely, you're right. You cannot change or keep up with changes on a day-to-day basis. But what you have to make sure that you do is that you reflect and hold up a mirror and are responsive to the kind of changing values and needs of society. I mean, so for example, if you look at the fashion industry, as little as I would say 5 or 10 years ago, the only people that you ever saw reflected in the fashion industry tended to be almost uniformly tall, thin, and white, and able-bodied, and sort of cisgendered. And those are the only people you ever saw. Now, in the last, decade, because of the explosion of the power of things like kind of Instagram and YouTube, which by far young people spend the most time on, and that media, social media, has become their media. They, the power of social media has dwarfed traditional media. So like 15-year-olds will go on Instagram every day. They might never buy a magazine in a year. Whereas like 15 years ago, all teenagers bought a magazine because that was their media. And in that media, you have kind of influencers and every sort of day people, and you see all kinds of images of people. You see people of all different colours and shapes and sizes and abilities. And so you've got this wonderful and enormous kind of diversity of representation. And what it very quickly did was it made the representation and the people that were becoming kind of celebrated and famous on social media like Instagram and YouTube were incredibly diverse, and they reflected that generation, the diversity of that generation. They celebrated the diversity of that generation. And what it's very quickly done, whether it's Vogue or Victoria's Secret or Calvin Klein, is it's made them look really out of date, because all they have is these kind of thin, tall, white models. And overnight almost, they look like they belonged in two different centuries. So all of a sudden, they're kind of tripping up on themselves to have trans models and plus size models and models of different ethnicities, which is a good thing. But that is a really good analogy of how they just didn't keep up with and reflect the kind of the values and the needs of that generation. And that is a perfect example of why the sort of stories and perspectives of any industry, it doesn't matter if you're not kind of cool and with it on a day-to-day basis, but you have to keep up with the overarching sort of trends and changes within those generations. And that really is the way you do that is you don't lock yourself in a way is in a boardroom and only respond to kind of like your investors and stuff like that. You really are involved with whether it's you hire or you work with sort of young people, because that's because it ultimately with any brand and industry to have to appeal to a generation, you kind of have to look like that generation. And the fashion industry is a perfect example. It suddenly just didn't look like what you were seeing and what was really going on, for example, Instagram and YouTube.
It's interesting, isn't it? So what you're essentially saying is that employers or companies just need to remain open-minded and flexible, as opposed to the opposite, which is closed-minded.
Yeah, I mean, and I that isn't just, I think when I sort of say that, because I sort of work with lots of industries, that doesn't mean that you it becomes like a complete democracy. And, because people sort of often translate that as, oh, well, does that mean if I'm open-minded, employers will just start turning up when they want to? It doesn't mean that at all. But absolutely, it absolutely requires a kind of an open-mindedness. And it's very kind of often used word, but I do think it's a good word, that kind of an authenticity. Because if you lose step, or you lose kind of touch with the people that you do want to appeal to, and almost every sort of industry or brand really needs young people to kind of subscribe to it and be into it, then absolutely, yeah, you have to sort of remain open-minded, and you have to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of that generation. I think that's really, really important. And when you don't, that's when you kind of fall down. I mean, it's always that, I mean, this is a bit more kind of analogous to the sort of food and drink industry, but and it's become even more sort of pertinent in the last year or so. But Pepsi using Black Lives Matter that couple of years ago, if you remember, using Kendall Jenner, and she solved police brutality and racism with a can of Pepsi, and it was painful to watch them get it so wrong that they used a tall, thin, incredibly rich, incredibly privileged white woman as the kind of the prop in this advert. It was like it made you put your like knuckles in your mouth. It was so bad, and it really, really damaged them as a brand. It damaged them monetarily. And if they'd had even just a couple of people who were young or who were, black or something on their board or influential in the company, and if they'd been listening and responsive to that generation, they would have understood how tone deaf that advert was, and they didn't. And it was disastrous for them. And that's a really good example of why it's not, PC or, right on to have a kind of your finger on the pulse that actually makes complete sense.
what I might say might be a little contentious. I agree that was wrong. But do you not think it's wrong for companies to get involved with those movements anyway? Because, for example, whether it's gay pride, using the rainbow, Black Lives Matters, whatever it is, I often find that companies do it just to say, oh, look, we're with it. We're behind this. Whereas I think that should be for the people to get behind, not businesses to use it as a marketing tool. Because in actual fact, a lot of the time, some of these companies have sort of, done negative things towards those communities without knowing, let's say, and they just use this logo as a way of saying, oh yeah, we're down and with it.
Oh, totally. And I completely agree with you that it's painful when it feels tokenistic. Like, when you see companies and they suddenly have like the LGBT rainbow flag all over their brand, or they suddenly have, the black square on their Instagram page. It's one thing if it feels like that's a company that's invested in those values and demonstrably has done for X number of years. And there are lots of brands who demonstrabably are invested in those things. And then that's fine. But I completely agree with you. When it feels kind of tokenistic and it's like, woo, look, aren't we being real and by supporting these organizations or these movements, it's painfully obvious, and I think it should be avoided at all costs. And there were companies who immediately sort of said, came out with the Black Lives Matter and actually practiced things that were anything in favor of Black Lives Matter, and there's a million examples of that. So I completely agree. If you don't practice those things and you don't have a history with whatever it is that you're saying that you support, I think it's best left alone. But all that being said, so for example, Nike, who before it was fashionable to do so, supported Colin Kaepernick. It wasn't all altruistic. They realised that it was really clever marketing and they were going to gain a more kind of diverse young audience. And I doubt they would have done that if they hadn't weighed up the risk versus the kind of the reward. But they were allowed to sort of say that because they had to some extent supported that kind of cause and gotten on that kind of that ride early on. But I completely agree with you that when brands just basically feels like they're hype a sort of cause for to say that they are or to sort of in a sort of a kind of performative way, I completely agree with you. It's icky and it should be left alone.
Yeah, I think so there's a few examples here. So I think that all these companies that are very heavily branded, Coke, Nike, Pepsi, and there's many more, I think they're all doing something quite bad. And I'm a free market guy. I like everyone to do whatever they want. And if I want to go get a can of Coke, I should. But what I'm getting at is that I think they use all of these campaigns to cover up something negative. Pepsi selling sugary drinks, Coke selling sugary drinks, Nike's history with, slave labor in other countries, not getting into conspiracies, just stuff that's come out, over the years. I'm sure they've dealt with it. So then they say, oh, we're really into this. And, in my view, what they should do, if they really want to get behind anything like Black Lives Matter or Me Too, why don't they bring in consultants? Why don't they bring people in and say, look, what can we be doing? What are we doing wrong? Have we got equality in this company, and so on and so on. I think surely that would be a lot better. Like you said, have people on the board from diverse backgrounds.
Oh yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I think the structural approach is really important. You can't have if you are a company with loads of skeletons in their closet, a LGBT flag or a BLM square or a feminist badge or whatever cause it is, feels like a sticking plaster over a big gaping wound. And I completely agree with you that companies really need to, if they are let's say not white, this is probably bad, but sort of not whiter than white, then it's much deeper than that. And I completely agree with you. It does then feel like they're almost using it as a sort of like, but we're good. Look, we're supporting this cause. We are good. And I completely agree with you. I mean, like a really good example of that is, with Nike doing, this whole kind of campaign about racial justice. And then I don't think it's conspiracy theory to point out. And everyone, well, what about the sweatshops in, poorer countries in the third world? And that, I think that's a completely fair point. Because you can't be for kind of justice because it makes you look good and it's a kind of the cause of the day, and then behind the scenes be completely unjust, but quietly so. And I think companies should be pulled up on those things. But maybe what this is doing is as now we live in a world where it's impossible to have secrets, and your faults, people are like sort of detectives on the internet, and people can really and thoroughly investigate who you are. I think what it means is that whether it's individuals or brands or companies, your secrets will be pulled out. And I think as a whole, and this is true whether it's because of our individual behaviours, like what kind of sense of humour, what jokes are acceptable, what words are acceptable, there's much more of a light of responsibility that shines on big companies, and they can get away with far less than they used to be able to. And generally speaking, I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think we're going to see more of people that work in companies holding the sort of the directors or managers more accountable. I think so, but I think it also needs to be quite fair the way it's directed. What one case, I know someone that worked for police in the offices, West Midlands Police, and it was mostly, I'd say in the offices, probably 90% women that work there. A woman walks through the office, says, "Morning, guys." Her manager pulls her and says, "If you don't apologise to the team, we're going to start an investigation." And she goes, "Oh, well, what did I do wrong?" And she goes, "You've just walked through a whole room of women and said, 'Morning, guys.'" And I do wonder, is that just a bit OTT?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I tend to be with you there. And I think that those stories sometimes get sort of highlighted because it is that kind of like, oh, well, look, we live in this kind of police state and this kind of police sort of culture. And I would hope that things like that are a rarity. And the thing that I would say to that, and I do agree with you, I think that pulling people up for misusing words when they're I think the thing of the nasty side of cancel culture is attacking people who have good intentions or had no ill intention at all, and saying "morning, guys" clearly had no ill intention at all. Because what it does is it undermines the important stuff by playing up on the not important stuff. And I think that is the really sort of pernickety and sort of dark side of cancel culture, is that it attacks the wrong people. Because if you're worried about people using like the wrong word here and there, then the really important stuff gets lost in the mix, or it kind of undermines the really important stuff. And I think, reasonable people will, be able to distinguish between, good intentions and ill intentions. But absolutely, it does go wrong. I mean, there was a really interesting sort of debate that bubbled up. I think it was, what does time mean anymore? But last week on about a Washington Post article where two women who had attended a party 2 years before, and a woman had gone in blackface, but it was supposed to be parodying Meghan. The lady who works for Fox News, who sort of said that blackface was acceptable, and they'd gone to the Washington Post and done sort of exposed this woman, and she'd lost her job, and then one of them lost their job, and it was such a mess of a story because it felt like it felt kind of, lots of people sort of said it was cruel and mean and achieved nothing, and it was just kind of like it was designed to sort of embarrass and ruin the life of someone who wasn't kind of been famous or in the spotlight. And I agree with you. I think we really have to move away from sort of kind of picking at each other at the small stuff, because I think the bigger stuff is so much more important.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere the other day, it said, like, I've had all these marches. And again, I agree with the precipice. I agree with the reasons. Don't get me wrong, but I think I read the other day and it said, "Oh, they've marched, they've done this, they've done that, but what have they got in return? They've had a few TV shows cancelled, a few people have lost their job, but was any law changed? Was any?" And I think that was the interesting thing. Like, no law has been changed from what I can tell, and I do wonder sometimes. Without getting into it too much, do laws need changing? Are the equality laws strong enough? Are they just not being enforced properly? I think every argument that's been had at the moment goes back to our equality laws. Are they being enforced? But I understand why people feel passionate about it. But at the moment, I don't think they've probably had the result they wanted.
Sort of the law isn't my kind of sort of area of specialty. And I think that certainly that I think that we live in a I think one of the real focuses has to be, I mean, I think equality is the real thing, but I think that obviously you've got racial equality and you've got gender equality, and you've got kind of class equality. But I think one of the things that is really interesting is that we live in societies now where there is such a kind of an inequality of wealth. And I think, now you've got a thing, and this is true across industries, where 20 years ago, the CEO would be paid like 4 times as much as the workers. And now it's something like 30 or 40 times. And I think sometimes sort of like, sort of the microaggressions and the smaller inequalities and the argument between, what's more important, gender equality or racial equality, sometimes is designed to distract from the fact of this massive, massive kind of economic inequality. And actually, if lots of people kind of lower on the sort of pay scale kind of group together, then that things would get fairer. But sometimes it feels like that in our attempt to fight about equality, we actually lose sight of the really important stuff, and there isn't kind of enough sort of solidarity. So in terms of like, do laws changing? I mean, yes, I'm sure there's lots of very imperfect laws, and I'm sure that there's lots and lots of laws that aren't being enforced properly. But I think within sort of companies and industries, I think that the way, rather than focus maybe on something that's kind of on a national scale, I think that the onus on companies should be that there is real fairness and really good dialogue within that company and with employers and employees, because I think that kind of communication, that kind of transparency and that sense of fairness lends itself to a much, much healthier, happier workplace. And I think if people, and this is particularly true of young people, feel kind of closed off or not able to express their concerns about the places they work. And I think this does happen a lot in the hospitality industry. I think that people do feel that there's elements that are very exploitative. I think you do get much more of that kind of focus on both the micro and the macro aggressions. And that's when you get a thing where you have very unhappy workplaces, you have people sort of complaining, you have people leaving. And I think that's very common, particularly in things like retail and hospitality.
Yeah. I think one thing I'd like to touch on is, this is the massive issue in some ways, is that the likes of Pepsi, Coke, Nike, and so on, these big FTSE 500 companies, they're the exact companies that get behind all of these, these marches, Black Lives Matter, and so on, and yet pay inequality is rife there. A CEO there would be on a lot more than someone in an office doing a normal job. And look, I don't want to get into it, but I think that is less likely to happen in a hospitality industry, in a pub, restaurant, and so on. I think, I'd bet the wage difference isn't hugely massive, within a hospitality business.
Oh no, absolutely. And I think, the smaller companies and the sort of, as you sort of say, the smaller pubs, the smaller independent restaurants, such as they are, if they can still exist, which I hope they can, you would absolutely get a much kind of less of a sort of disparity between, let's say, kind of the economic top and the bottom. I think, slightly moving away from kind of the inequality thing for a second, that I think the big problem with the hospitality industry and the sort of food and drink industry, irrespective of whether it's big or small, and this is very specific to the UK, is where young people are concerned, is that the marketing on the hospitality industry is all wrong. And here's why I think that. It's because we as a country, I don't think, take the hospitality industry seriously enough. We tell kids, and by that I mean sort of teenagers and so on, that like waiting or bartending or managing a restaurant or managing a hotel, that the party line on that tends to be is that it's a job you do part-time as a teenager to get through school or college or university, and it's not a career. Whereas in America or in Europe, they have that in America, they have an Ivy League school. I think it's the Cornell University, the hospitality course. It's an Ivy League. That's an incredibly sort of serious top league university that, teaches about the kind of the industry as a whole. And you have absolutely something sort of similar in kind of Switzerland and France, because I've spoken at those. And as industries, they are absolutely they're central to the kind of economic thrust in the economic power of the country. And in those countries, they are viewed far more seriously as a career option for young people. And they're seen as a real kind of career ladder. You can start off in a very, dishwashing or, busing, and you can move. It's an industry that you can move through very meritocratically. It's not about who your dad is or who your mum went to school with or whatever. It's if you're good at the job, you can move through it. And it's taken seriously. I don't think that it has that reputation in the UK at all. And I think it's viewed as a very sort of transient, very sort of part-time gig. It has very little, I'm sorry to say, I'm not impugning people, but it has very little respect as a job. If you went home and said to your parents, I'm going to be a waiter and I'm going to move my way up and manage a restaurant, I doubt there's lots of parents who'd be as happy as if you went home and said, I'm going to be a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher. And that, is obviously, and I it's not my area of expertise, but I imagine it's a really, really interesting, rewarding career, for example, managing a restaurant, but it simply doesn't have that kind of reputational clout, particularly with young people, that I think other careers maybe do.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And this is something that's been discussed massively. And a friend of mine, well, not a friend, but a chap that I know quite well, he was on the podcast a while ago, Steve Lachlan, and he's a front of house manager. And he says, I think the problem stems from the fact that the British like to be served, not to serve. It's a very imperialistic view. And I do wonder, does it go back to that? But what would you change? If that's the case, if we've got those mindsets, where does it start? Is it at home? Is it with the parents that want their kids to do better? Is it with the employers that probably could pay more or train better? Where or is it a combination of things?
I think it's all those things, because and it's not just the hospitality industry in the UK. And I think maybe that will start to change a bit, but we have a very dodgy view of vocational industries, whether it's plumbing, electrician, hairdressing, waitressing, barring. Those are sort of vocational industries. And at core, they're not really careers that require academic degrees. Now, in the UK, we put on absolute pedestal. I mean, I'm sure you know that, of your parents is everything. All of school is geared towards academic success, and there's no room within this British schooling system to say, actually, I'm really, really I'm no good at maths, I'm no good at English, I'm not interested in Shakespeare. All I want to do is manage a bar. All I want to do is be an ace hairdresser. And in other countries, you can leave sort of academic school and learn to do those things, and that makes total sense. If you know you want to do that, if you're good at those things, why the hell isn't there room within the schooling system to actually allow for that? And there's lots of debates over kind of it's not even a low quality. There's no room for young people who are interested in those careers. There's no exploration of them at all. And then added to sort of that, and I think there is a truth to that, and I think it's something the industry needs to address. It's certainly not the highest paid industry, going in as a junior chef or a junior sort of bar staff. I don't know, you know better than I would what the pay is, but I know it's very low, and they're brutal hours and they're antisocial hours, and it is really hard work. So that kind of package, that whole package, it's not celebrated as a career, it's not pushed by parents, there's no room for it in school, it's poorly paid. Of course it's not gonna, kids aren't gonna go, well, that's a really sexy career I want to go into. So I think at root it's an industry that needs to be totally kind of repackaged and resold. But it's not entirely the industry's fault. I think there's other aspects of society that could really work with the industry to promote it. So, why isn't there more celebrated sort of courses that, kids can go into at age 16 or 17 or 18? And why isn't there enough of a kind of consensus that says to young people, it's fine that you're not brilliant at maths and you're not a great historian and you're not interested in Shakespeare, and it's a really good thing that you want to become a mixologist or any of those things, or you want to become a chef. We just don't have that perspective, whereas you would do in Europe and America and sort of beyond.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that, further on that point is yesterday, me and a friend were talking about essentially the Australia points-based system that they're bringing to the UK. And as contentious as it is, you can see how someone said, they should put hospitality on that list. And then the argument for not putting hospitality on that list to bring in staff from abroad is so that the people that employ over here end up paying more for British talent. And so I can see how that helps employees. But I can also see how that probably affects restaurants. And I think, the only way you're going to get someone into a restaurant to work if they're not interested in it initially anyway, is by paying more. And after that, they might enjoy it and be shocked that actually it's a good career path and so on and so on. But I think it all starts by getting people through the door. And obviously then, and then someone said to me, oh, well, the work ethic's different over here. People from Europe work harder. People from America work harder, and so on. And I was thinking, well, that's going to have to change as well, because if in my view, if you want to employ those people or have to employ those people, the work ethic will have to change.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, for better or worse, I certainly didn't vote for it, but we are going to Brexit. And obviously, you only have to step into a bar or a restaurant to see how many people from Europe and overseas are employed by that industry. And if they don't have that free and open access to working in Britain, we're going to have to find that work resource, so those people, at home. Now, if absolutely, as you say, you're not going to overnight wave a magic wand and have queues of really good British young people suddenly flooding into bars and restaurants saying, kind of, give me a job. So it actually almost, I think, starts before that. So in order to sort of fulfill that criteria, which is currently being filled by people from overseas in very well, this isn't a criticism, extremely well, absolutely, you're going to have to change the perception of the industry. And as you say, there will have to be some sense that it's a well-paid job, or certainly commensurate with other jobs that you can walk into at age 18, 19, 20. Because, because there is, and it makes logical sense, because, there is now obviously a sort of a living London wage, which I think more, companies rightly should subscribe to. If you are working in a job, and this is true of anyone of any age, but I think it really particularly impacts on young people because they're the ones who feel the brunt of it. If you are working really hard in a job and you can't make rent, or you can't pay your bills, and you can't have a reasonable quality of life, be able to afford your own food, for example, that is not going to motivate you to stay in a job or work hard in a job. So it has to sort of be, everybody has to kind of be all hands on deck to sort of create a work experience and a work industry that works for everyone.
Yeah. And I think, it's worth noting that I think here's the thing. And I think from the government's point of view, or whoever advises them, you've got 3.5 million people unemployed. I just quickly had a quick check. You've got 3.5 million people unemployed. So they would say, why do we need to bring people from abroad when we've got these 3.5 million people employed? Now, they're not all suitable, obviously. They're probably suitable to other jobs. So I think that's what it's always going to come down to, really. I think from a government point of view is that if we've got people over here that are healthy and can do this job, how can you get them into that job?
Well, yeah, on paper that sounds fantastic, but then there's been this massive. We've seen that, like, with this fruit picking thing.
Yeah.
And there was this like drive of like, they kind of ripped off that kind of monologue of Train Spotting in that really cringy way in the kind of Waitrose adverts. And there was, all this kind of like, this kind of, again, that performative thing of I signed up, and then nobody showed up. And again, I not, to sort of not to sort of be negative, but you can't, if that's the sort of the mindset of the country, that simply isn't going to work.
No.
It's not enough to say, so, there's 3 million spaces, so, show up tomorrow with a ready and willing attitude. That kind of, it's a shift of attitude that has to kind of change.
I feel the only difference worth noting, not to argue, because I'm not like that, is it's just the fact that that's back-breaking work, and working in a restaurant probably isn't anymore anyway. I guess it's tiring, there's no doubt, and it's still hard work, but I wouldn't say it's back-breaking. You're not bending over picking strawberries.
No, absolutely. And I mean, and again, I think that there's that other level of kind of, that sort of picking sort of fruit is sort of seen, in that almost kind of like antiquated, living off the land, old fashioned, and thinking, in the mindset of like, a Gen Zer, that work is for better want of a better word, very unsexy. Whereas, as you sort of say, waitressing or waitering in a restaurant or tending bar probably would be more appealing. But I would argue, the way, from having sort of spoken to lots of young people, that whatever the industry is doing to promote that as a career, it's not really working that well. Because when you talk to young people, I would say the sort of indigo of kind of like enthusiasm about going into those jobs isn't that high. And I think it's not really the industry's fault, because there's such for example, with Gen Z, because they are absolutely digital natives, there's such an obsession with certain industries, so the tech industry or the beauty industry, that in some ways the hospitality industry kind of sort of sits in the shade a bit. And again, it is all that marketing thing. I don't think that the hospitality industry has kept abreast, is kept up enough with the changes of young people, and it's not really at the core the problem necessarily of the job itself. I just don't think they're marketing right to young people, and I think they really have to kind of figure out how they're doing it, because whatever they're doing, the message probably isn't resonating as much as it could.
Yeah, and just to finalise that point, I think that one of the things that you see in the hospitality industry is that the head chefs are celebritized, the sort of business people, they're looked upon, but people doing the normal jobs don't really get any sort of, no one's really overly proud of them. You do see a few chains do it, but not every day you see someone say, look at this team. Without this team, we wouldn't be able to do any of this. But it's generally always the head chef or the
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think just kind of adding to your point, I think if anything, because sort of you saw loads of like shows about the food and drink industry, but if anything, I think that did damage to it. So, because for example, the Gordon Ramsay phenomenon, which has died away a bit, but it was huge at one point. All that did was suggest to young people, if you were like 12 or 13 watching that and thinking, I'm really interested in food, and you saw that, all you saw was some horrible old git shouting and screaming and swearing at his staff and his underlings. And you see that all the time in the sort of MasterChef shows. It's pressure, 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 shout, 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 shout. Though they are entertaining to watch, there's no way you would have watched that as a 12 or 13-year-old and thought, wow, that looks like a really cool career. You might think being Gordon Ramsay is being cool, but there's sure as hell wouldn't think, well, it looks really fun being a junior chef or a junior bartender. It looked awful, and it was a massive mistake. And I think they really need to flip that and start showing, yes, it's a challenging career, but the positive elements of that. I think that was a real mistake they made. They made rock stars out of Gordon Ramsay or Jamie Oliver, but they certainly didn't show the rest of the industry in a good light.
Yeah, I agree. And I think most of the chefs that I talk to have turned their back on that type of running a kitchen. Don't get me wrong, they've all had a laugh and they all do a bit of hazing and a bit of fun. But in terms of that sort of very anger, the stress, they try and all have like different kitchens now. And I think they're probably ahead of the curve, because it will be mandated at some point, because mental health in hospitality is probably at a pretty low point, to be honest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that the funny thing is that has really trickled out. Like, in US, you see a lot about, the drug abuse, mental health issues in the industry. And funnily enough, young people are aware of those things. Now, I think that, like, having spoken a lot to the industry, there's been some amazing programs, particularly dealing with things like mental health and addiction within the industry. I've sort of heard some incredible things. But that stuff, it's really important to young people. This is a generation. Generation Z are a generation incredibly attuned to mental health issues. And actually, if the industry made more of stuff like that, yes, it's long hours, but we have a real laugh together and we have some drinks after work. And if you have mental health issues, you will be supported, and we're a family and we're a team. Why isn't that spoken about much? Because I tell you what, that would work far better than sort of, kind of any other message, that this is a team where you'll make friends and you're in a team and there's community spirit and you're looked after if you find right. That is a message that will work well with young people, and it's simply not being sort of highlighted enough as an industry at all.
And from a parental point of view, I can see why parents wouldn't want their kids to go into an industry like what's perceived as Gordon Ramsay and so on and so on and so on. Not to blame him for it, because obviously what you've got to understand, that is a TV show as well. But I think that if people watch that and think, whoa, I bet most chefs are like that, and to be fair, most people with a clipboard can be a bit gobby anyway. So you can see why you wouldn't want people to go, your kids to go in that industry. But I think you're right. If you can highlight the perceptions, highlight the realities instead of the perceptions. It's a family unit. We all get along. We have a drink at the end of the shift. We all care about each other. That would probably, create an influx, if anything.
Oh, totally. Because, if like kids, I think they also have a massive horror, understandably, of that, in a cubicle, nothing but a number typing away at a keyboard. And promoting the industry to kids as every night or every day is different. You have a wicked team, you'll have a laugh together, you learn loads of stuff. Again, that inherent message is so much more appealing than just going to an office 9 to 5, tapping on a computer, answering emails. But again, and this is again falls down to that marketing thing, the industry is really manifestly not really getting that message across to young people. And again, that goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier about, maybe working with schools, the sort of messaging of the industry, how it's promoted, but it's simply not getting through to young people that it's those things and more.
So one thing that we've touched on a little bit, but I want to press on it a little bit more, is minimum wage, living wage. Gen Zs see themselves as capable. Forget about perceptions for a moment from everyone else, but they see themselves as capable. They see themselves worth the same money as people 10 years older than them. Do you think something like, the living wage, where it puts people into age brackets, should that be a thing? Should it be a meritocracy as opposed to an age bracket?
No, I don't think it should be an age bracket, and I think that's a real mistake, because I think if I think what that does then is I think it creates actually poor sort of work performance at the top, that people think, well, I've been here. You get that culture a lot in some industries. Well, I've been here for 20 years. So by dint, and I'm really naff at my job, and I'm lazy, and I don't do anything, and I don't come in with any ideas, and I don't change anything. But by dint of me being here for 20 years, I'm in management, and I get paid loads more than a 21-year-old who's working their butt off and working like way over hours and coming in with all these inventive ideas and is a real asset to the company. That is just really demoralizing for anyone who's young. And it's like, well, I'm bringing so much more in, and this person who does nothing gets paid 3 times as much. And that happens in so many industries. So no, I think it's a huge mistake to pay people per time. I think it absolutely should be performance related. And that's not to say, it should be fair. So it's like you don't have to like jump through hoops and perform miracles to get a pay rise. That's not what I mean at all. But I genuinely think that if you are an amazing worker and you're inventive and you bring in like ideas at work or all of those things, then your pay and your promotion should reflect that. And again, I think particularly with younger workers, that kind of sense of like paths to promotion that aren't dictated by time. Oh, well, if I stay here another year, I will get a pay rise. That's really not a good incentive to sort of do well, because you think, well, I could, whether I'm really hardworking or I do absolutely nothing, and I'll get a pay rise in 12 months. That's a crazy payment structure. I think it should be far, far more meritocratic.
It should be essentially the whole, starting from application to sort of the job itself. It should probably be more experience and role based. So, for example, you could say, we've got this job going. It's 25 grand a year, for argument's sake. It's a junior level job, and then let whoever apply for it, whether they're 60, whether they're 20. It shouldn't really matter, because everything works around the role, then, shouldn't it? Absolutely,
and I think that. Experience does matter. All that being said, and I talk to loads about Gen Zs about this, the thing that they find totally dispiriting and demoralizing is when entry level jobs say things like, well, this is an entry level job, but you have to have 4 years experience, 6 placements, and they're like, how can I have done that?
Yeah.
I've just graduated from university. How can I have work experience for an entry level job? So there also has to be very realistic entry points, but that after that, I think that you've got this entry point that does allow young people to get into industries, but absolutely beyond that, the whole kind of, promotion structure, the payment structure absolutely should be what you do in that job and not just the fact that you've been there for 30 years.
Yeah, that makes sense. And even like, if you look at sort of like hospitality, I had a friend of mine and he was saying, I hate employing younger people because they're lazy. And that was his perception. And I said to him, I said, how'd you pay them? And he goes, well, I pay them minimum wage. And I said, so they'd get less than the next tier up, wouldn't they? And he goes, yeah. And I said, how about you pay them all the same? And he was like, well, that's a stupid idea. They're young. And I was like, yeah, but what labour do they give you? Forget about age. Could they perform just as well as the tier above if they were getting paid the same?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's a huge motivation. I spoke to a CEO recently. I won't say which company because it's not something they openly promote. But when a woman gets pregnant in their company, and it's a massive old company, they give her a bonus. They actually give her a bonus. And I said, why did they do that? And they said, because we have in our 70 years, and obviously, they've started doing this quite a long time ago. We have, and I know a great company to work for. Women come back, and we work out kind of a part-time sort of structure. And he said, we've never lost a woman to maternity leave, and we have this absolute kind of sense that they can come back and will be sort of flexible, and they come back and they get sort of back into the job, and there isn't that anxiety that there's going to be resentment about it. And I thought that was really clever. That it almost feels with industries that we punish certain groups. You punish people because they're young. You punish people because they're inexperienced. You punish people because they have a baby and go on maternity leave. These are things that people can't help. You can't help that it's your first job. You can't help having a family. You should be supported in those things. What you can help is what you do in the job. Yeah. And as an employee, I think that is your job. You can structure your payment around those things. You shouldn't penalise people because it is their first time job and pay them less than someone who has been there for 2 years. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while, and you've brought the conversation round. So I'm going to throw it in now because you've mentioned it. I didn't think it had much relevance, but I think it does now, the way the conversation's gone. But for example, women have no choice. They have a menstrual cycle. They have no choice. That's the way biology dictated it. They have babies. Why is it that the government don't just say, here's what happens in this instance? It's got to be extra equalitative. There shouldn't be any room for error there. And it shouldn't be left to the employer to sort of give a bonus or make them feel like they should come back. It should just be, this is biological. We shouldn't be penalised for that.
I completely agree. If you go, Scandinavia, which, and I know they're small countries and they have much less people within the economy, but they are incredibly economically successful countries. And in those countries, when you have a baby, you get a year's full pay, and so does your male partner. He can have a paternity leave, and they have these incredibly sort of rich, booming economies. And it seems to be in the UK, in the USA, that we view sort of having kind of children and families kind of in terms of like loss. And it's somehow that you're kind of like, you're betraying the company. And I think that there is this whole kind of, this sort of circle of shame that exists around kind of having children and maternity. And it's almost like a conflict between the individual and company. And absolutely, if you had a sort of system in place whereby people felt economically secure to sort of go away and sort of have sort of maternity and paternity leave, and there was a really good system in place of having people who were trained to sort of fill those roles. And again, that's something you could think about sort of training up younger people to do. But again, it feels like our response to maternity cover is a bit similar to our response to the pandemic cover. It's a sort of panicked slightly half-assed, not very well thought out response. And as a result, none of it works, none of it's very good, and all the parties suffer. So I completely agree. It's that kind of wholeness and completeness of a response. In all, people have been having kids since like the beginning of time, and since certainly the beginning of work time. So why is it that we're so far behind the curve on something that almost, the vast majority of people will go through at some point in their life?
Yeah, I think the government just need to pick up the tab there, and they need to say to these companies, we're going to pick up the tab. They're having a baby. They're going to be off for a year. Get it sorted. Here's the money. And I think that way, there's no ifs or buts then. The company can't try fudge the way out of it then.
No, absolutely. Because again, it's like what boils down to sort of discrimination. You can't discriminate people because of the colour of their skin. You can't discriminate. You're certainly not supposed to. You can't discriminate about people you're not supposed to because of their gender or any of those things, their religion. And people can't help having babies. There's no way out of it. And we can't help the fact that women have babies. There's not an alternative. And it's a sort of a biological function that, humans kind of respond to. So it is crazy in any industry that it still feels like it's on some level kind of an acceptable form of discrimination. And absolutely, the government and sort of companies should work much better together to ensure it doesn't happen.
I do wonder if half the time is that the government, or all governments really, probably and employers still haven't figured out that women come to work. They don't just stay home and look after families anymore. And I wonder if it's just that they're just still catching up, whereas really they just need to start with a fresh slate and say everyone's an employee. If biologically you have babies, then we're going to look after you here, and let's carry on. And and let's not make a big deal out of it.
No, absolutely. And it's a strange country in lots of ways, because I do like lots of work and lots of sort of talk in Europe, and it feels when you go there in so many ways it's so much more progressive than we are. And again, and this is, I think, a huge sort of concern of sort of Brexit, that I think we were once an incredibly inventive, incredibly sort of leading country that led the way and was ahead of the curve on so many things, and we're simply not. And I think sometimes the UK is sometimes kind of like cashing on their kind of reputation and what they were in the past, and it's simply not there now.
Yeah.
And as you say, all these things, whether it's the pandemic or maternity rights or the conversation of a minimum wage, or the fact that when we Brexit there is not going to be this new workforce to replace the one that's leaving, it just highlights the fact that there is just so many structural problems in the country, and it is really problematic.
Yeah, I do think we are also ahead of many countries in many ways as well. Like the support that companies have been given over this COVID period have been above and beyond many other countries. And if we look at normal times, a friend of mine lives in Cyprus. She had a baby. I think she got something like 12 weeks off maternity leave, and I think leaving it to the employer is wrong. I think this is where the government need to say, we're picking up the tab, do what you've got to do to find someone else to replace this person for a while, and then they're coming back in a year's time. And that person that's working, the government's giving you your wage for a year or something, because I think leaving it up to companies on their own, it's not that they're doing it maliciously. Sometimes they probably just can't afford to pay someone for 12 months whilst replacing them with someone else. So I think that's where all governments just need to be bold and say, we realise this, we accept it, we're going to cover it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and the thing is, broadly speaking, it makes economic sense, because if people feel supported in what whether it's going to have kids or during the pandemic, what the first thing you do is, if you're completely panicked about money and you don't have any, you don't have a cushion underneath you at all, under beyond a month or 2 months, you stop spending. You stop spending on anything but the basics, which has an even sort of like wider and deeper kind of economic impact. So yeah, a sort of supported country with kind of economic resources and an economic cushion tend to be successful countries. It's not really rocket science. And again, yeah, I completely agree with you. But our country doesn't seem to have that approach in many ways.
No. So do you think more effort should be made, in sort of learning how to work with, I put millennials here, but I meant Gen Z? Should more effort go into helping sort of Gen Z, rather than just trying to sell to them. A lot of effort and money is poured into figuring out their marketing, the way they like to spend and the way they like to follow, influence and so on, instead of actually just saying, right, how can we learn to employ these people?
No, I mean, I don't think that there's ever been, for a long time, certainly, much investment. And I think it's a bit of a function of, kind of a Tory government and sort of, kind of the stripping back of educational resources. I don't think there's anything like adequate career training, career resources. I mean, like when I've talked extensively with Gen Z about this. And when you say to the vast majority of kids, particularly kids in the state school system, what kind of career advice did you have? What kind of career training did you have? What kind of work experience do you have? It is minimal. It is pitiful. And, and if you go to, for example, a private school, it's much, much, much richer. And in some ways, those are possibly kids that need those resources less for all kinds of different reasons. So we have a system whereby you have a whole generation, and this isn't by any means going to stop with Generation Z. I think this is going to get worse, who have in their whole kind of school careers in the most kind of, sort of changeable parts of their life, and where you make all kinds of decisions about who you are and where you're going, have had everything has been geared towards exam results. Nothing is geared towards where you're going to take those exams. So you have a sort of system where you at age 13 or 14, you take your school options, which will impact the GCSEs you take, which will impact the kind of A levels or, the baccalaureate or the kind of BTEC courses you take. And those directly impact probably where you will be carried for the rest of your life. And it is insane. It is bonkers that no one is sitting a 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old down all those really significant points of their life and saying in a very serious way, what is it that you want to do and how can we help you make those decisions? And moreover, because, a careers instructor is just one person, a career instructor, again, why isn't there more collaboration with industries, particularly industries, and all industries will eventually employ young people? Why isn't there more interaction with young people to say, look, here we are, we're a really good industry, and we will give you sort of insight into our industry. You get when you go to university, particularly when you go to the good universities, everyone suddenly show up at these career fairs and say, hey, come and work for us. But I actually believe by the time you're 18 or 19, that's almost a little bit late. I think kids should start being interacting with industries, hospitality, medicine, education, law, retail, all of those things. I think about, year 9 or 10, because I think you do start to sort of, it is an influential age and you should sort of start to think, and it's not as if you can't change your mind. But again, there are so many industries, and I absolutely would include the hospitality industry, that don't configure in young people's heads because they just don't really have an experience of them.
I think one of the things that I find is a similarity between the Gen Z and the baby boomers to some degree is that a lot of Gen Zs are probably thinking of going to university less and going into apprenticeships and getting straight into work. Do you think that maybe this emphasis over the last sort of, let's say, year 2000 and onwards, this emphasis on go to university, is that finally starting to wane off now?
For sure. And largely, I think it's economically driven, because university, 3 years at university will leave you with about a 50 or 60,000 pound bill. Now, to spend 50 or 60,000 pounds on anything at any point in your life, you have to be pretty damn sure that that's a good investment. I wouldn't I wouldn't stick 50 grand on a horse or, stick 50 grand in a company if I wasn't absolutely dyed in the wool certain that it was a sort of stable company. And what kids are increasingly seeing, and I think completely fairly so, is that it's not a good investment. They are leaving university at the most sort of at the beginning of their adult lives, this enormous debt and nothing to really show for it. Now, if you go into a job that you have to go to university for, so for example, medicine, There is no way that you can become a doctor by looking at videos on the internet or doing some work experience. That's just not possible. But that, and ditto, lots of other jobs, law, teaching, or all of those kind of more traditional industries. Now, but if you, for example, think about something like hospitality or PR or retail, I think an increasing argument, and this isn't just from kids, this is actually from the industry themselves, is that they would prefer work experience over learning PR at university or learning about kind of the hospitality industry at university. Now, I'm not here to really make that judgment call, but I can completely understand and I sympathise with that point of view. And frankly, having spent so much time with kids from a different background, kids who in some industries, in lots of industries, who didn't go to university, went straight into the workplace, got the work experience, or even started earning in those 3 years where their sort of contemporaries and peers are at university, and they're in a much better position. So I absolutely, I'm not knocking learning or higher education because it's absolutely necessary in some industries, but I don't think it is in other industries. And I think lots of young people are really cottoning onto the fact, and they feel like it's become a bit of a business where they're kind of being sold it as their only option. And I think that's a huge mistake. And again, that's very, very dependent on industries to kind of swoop in and say, look, you really, really don't need a degree to come here. Come in and learn the industry, and that will put you in a much better stead. And again, I don't think that message is trickling through enough to young people.
No, I think so too. And a lot of older generations always look down on the next generation as crapper. It's probably always been the way of time, hasn't it? But a lot of people always like to point the finger at Gen Z. Oh, they're lazy, they're this, they're that, they've never lived through anything. Well, now they've just lived through COVID to some degree. Have they changed, would you say? Or do they seem more focused or anything?
Generation Z,
yeah.
I think fundamentally it has sort of focused and changed all of us. And I think, it's very new. We're getting on for 4 months into this. And I don't think that change kind of happens overnight. But I think kind of it goes, full circle back to the beginning of this conversation about how it kind of affected us personally, that I think it's made all of us sort of reflect on, our personal relationships and what we like to do and what we kind of value, and sort of who we are kind of as people, because in some ways, without all the whistles and bells of life, I think it's been a bit of a kind of a teller about who we are and what we enjoy and who we kind of resonate with. So, I mean, I think it's probably a bit early to say if it's really affected them in the long term. But I think one of the interesting paradoxes of the COVID is that the interesting thing is with older people, with boomers and stuff like that, I think it's made them give them a sort of a bit of a baptism by fire in technology, and they've all become like Zoom happy, and Facebook is huge with older people, and suddenly get into kind of like electronic communication because that's been their only source of communication. Whereas younger people have almost gotten into more kind of old-fashioned things. We've suddenly gotten into like games and knitting and gardening and all those things, and those things have become more popular with young people. So it's almost like this kind of like paradoxical flip. But no, I mean, I think the sort of the impact of COVID is a much longer arc, in terms of education, in terms of the economy, in terms of jobs. And I think we'll have to watch very closely. And I do think it's going to be a rocky ride for everybody, but particularly younger people in the next kind of year or so.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one of the final points I wanted to make was how vital is managerial leadership right now. You're dealing with lots of different generations, and one of the trickiest is probably Gen Z. They're very social media aware. Some would argue they're probably more susceptible to like personality disorders like narcissism and so on, only because of the online thing, maybe not publicly. How would a manager deal with all these things?
I think the key, one of the things that astonishes me, and it's such a contrast in terms of kind of things like retention and work happiness, is that companies that have fantastic and very clear training and very, very sort of clear, guidelines on everything. It sounds crazy, but from like dress to hours to what happens if you do have a complaint to all of those kind of things that maybe we take for granted if you've worked for a long time, but you shouldn't take for granted if you're coming into the workplace. I think if those things are very solid and very clear for young people, the happiness and the sort of satisfaction and the retention is so much higher than jobs that don't. I mean, we recently had a bit of an internet chuckle, let's say, at the Netflix new employee handbook, because it was like so thick. It was like, 4 times like that kind of old-fashioned phone book, and covered things in ridiculous detail. But they have a very sort of very satisfied, very happy, very enthusiastic workforce that they retain. So obviously that kind of worked. Added to which, they have a very open policy on kind of communication between kind of managers and lower level employers. And, whenever I talk to people about employers, I was like, the channels of communication are really important. Open working days where there's a kind of democracy and everyone works together are really important. So I think that the way that you really, and there's much more kind of detailed ways. If anyone sort of wants to ask me about it directly, that's fine. But I think the really key things are clarity and communication. And I think if young people feel that they have that, I think that's a recipe generally for kind of sort of feeling kind of happy in the workplace and a tendency to stay.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, actually. Just learn what sort of gets them going, and make them feel safe and rewarded.
Absolutely. I think, and we might say, oh, well, they're not children, let's not mollycoddle them. But if these are sort of basic things, and if it creates a kind of a happy and safe work environment, what's the problem here? I was chatting to a lad the other day, actually, who was working in the hospitality industry, and he got fired on his second day. And I said to him, "What did you do?" And he said, "Oh, I came in at 10." And I said to him, "Weren't you?" What time are you supposed to start? And he said, "Oh, I don't know. They didn't really tell me. So I assumed it was around about 10. And I'm not saying that wasn't his fault. I'm sure that was a lot to do with his fault. But I think, there's absolute, that clarity. If you don't come in by 9:30, these are the consequences. Then it's there out there, and they can't say they didn't know. But that's a kind of an exaggerated sort of like thing, but it's not uncommon at all. But I think it is that kind of clarity of detail that everybody's on the same page. Everybody knows what the rules are.
So I think in some ways what you're saying is, because I suppose there was a video I saw on YouTube recently, and he said how millennials haven't been told no before. They've been told Gen Zs, they've all been told that they're special, that they can make a change, make a difference, that they all get a participation medal. And when they go to work, all of a sudden there's real things that need doing. There's targets, there's times to get in, there's this, that, the other. And there is a bit of a disparity there. So in a way, what you're saying is employers need to make things written, obvious and enforced so people know what they're doing.
Absolutely. I mean, and like this is true from like millennials downwards, that society in general has been organised for young people. And I'm not saying whose fault this is, but it has been organised in general, whether it's parents or schooling, to do almost everything for them and constantly tell them that they're great. So when they go into a workplace where it's not just designed for their satisfaction and their comfort, and everybody's going to tell them that they're wonderful and fantastic like their parents and teachers, and it comes as a bit of a shock just because they've never experienced it before. And to some extent, that's not their fault, that they didn't create that system. So absolutely, I think going in very early on and saying, these are our expectations of you. This is what you must do. If you do these things and do them well, these are the kind of the good things that will happen. And if you don't, these are the bad things that will happen. And I think really focusing on the positives, because I do genuinely think carrot works far better than stick. It's demoralizing on your first day to be told terrible things will happen to you if you don't do these things. It's much better to go the approach of all these wonderful things will happen to you if you're a great employee. But absolutely, if it's all there, and it's all clear and it's all explained, and there's a week or 2 weeks or whatever it can be allowed dedicated towards kind of a positive training experience, there is no one who can then say, I didn't know, or it wasn't clear.
I feel a bit better about the fact that I told my nearly 6-year-old son recently, he goes, "Oh, Dad, we lost at football at school." He goes, "We should have won." And I said, "Well, if you lost, that means you all weren't good enough." So I feel better about that now.
I think it's absolutely that thing, because in life, no one gives you a participation trophy at work. You get a trophy for doing really good work. And I think that, as nice as it is to sort of be kind and gentle with your kids, you also have to prepare them for the reality that that's not the reality of the world.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, in the gentlest way possible, I don't think we should go back to that Victorian thing of like beating your children or throwing rulers at kids at schools or anything like that. But it's only fair to prepare young people for the realities of the world, because it isn't designed for their pleasure. And I think that the sooner that young people are aware of that and are sort of prepared for that, really, in some ways, the better prepared they are for the world in general, and certainly the workplace.
Someone I know works at a workplace, quite a big employer, and they give out bonuses just for attendance. Like, so if people go in 5 days a week for a month or 3 months or 6 months, whatever, they get a bonus. And I thought to myself, well, surely that's a basic requisite that, you just need to come in and do the work. And that for me, that bonus doesn't even kick in if you did well. It's just thanks for coming in. Like, so I did think to myself, wow, that's not somewhere I'd like to work personally, but I can, maybe they had a really poor attendance of people coming in.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's an interesting case study, because if you do have this sort of appalling work attendance, and bearing in mind lots of schools give out prizes for 100% attendance, in some ways that's kind of quite clever. And it seemed, I think, to the outside world, that's ridiculous. You're rewarding someone for doing like the basics, but absolutely, rather than that employer doing that, you'll get punished and penalised for not showing up. It's doing the opposite thing of you'll get rewarded for showing up all the time. So I think in some ways that is quite clever. And I think there are some instances, when the stick is kind of necessary. But yeah, I think generally speaking, it is a sort of the psychological makeup of sort of Generation Z, which it is all about kind of reward and sort of gentleness and that kind of thing. So being an employer who is more about the reward than the punishment, I think for this particular generation actually kind of makes sense. And if you think about, like, so for example, Google, which is a very, very, very competitive, extremely high rated, it's very, they expect a lot of their employees, really hard to get into, hugely competitive to get into, but there's so many rewards. The lovely rooms, the free, the sort of the canteen lunches that are free, all of those kind of things. I've spent lots of time doing stuff at Google, and that is, that's that very sort of, kind of, very sort of new millennial-ish kind of approach to work, but it's clearly working.
But the only downside, the flip side with all of those, I'm going to say insular perks, is because they don't want you to leave. They want you to get in at they want you to get in at 6 a.m. They want you to sit on a beanbag and work, and they don't want you to leave. So they want you to do your washing here, get your gym done here, and I think, but. If on the flip side, what I'd probably like to see more of is more of a slow approach. For example, Aldi in the UK, the supermarket, they switch off their email servers at 7 o'clock. They say, once you're home, you're home. You will not respond to work. We don't want you working. Whereas the types of all these tech types, they want to keep you in work 24 hours a day. Like, if you want to go slope off in another room and have 10 minutes sleep, you can. And I wonder what's actually better for people. They may not know it yet, but it might actually be better to actually switch off at 7 o'clock and have a life with your family, as opposed to sitting there waiting for your washing to come out whilst you're working.
But the interesting thing is that I was last summer in Google, Norway, and I was there at 6 o'clock for a talk, and it was empty. And they make everyone go home at 6 o'clock. Okay. So that's very much an American English approach and not a European approach. I was genuinely shocked, having spent lots of time at Google in London and Google in America. And I was like, this is a ghost town. Whereas everyone, and he was like, I'm not going to do the accent. Really like cool, sort of like Norwegian guy. And he's like, it's 6 o'clock. They go home to their families. So we're really judging that from that kind of, American, I think it's increasingly sort of like, bleed your work, do 22 hours a day and have half an hour sleep. And I agree with you. I totally sort of see that is that softly sort of way of making you spend your whole life at work. So again, I think very much it's all about balance.
Yeah, pros and cons. Well, Chloe, you've given me lots of your time today. I could talk to you all day. Like, honestly, it's been amazing. And I think everyone who to be fair, I was reading your book. I'm not going to lie. And I went to the hospital last week and I took it with me. And I thought, it's going to be a really difficult book to read. I think by the time I got my appointment, I was halfway through it. And I didn't read every person's account, but, it's just staggering. Like, it was bizarre. it felt odd reading their thoughts, and it made me think, wow, like every parent should read this book, I think, straight away, because parents would probably be shocked to know that their children do those things, and B, think. I think we'll just think, oh, teenagers don't think. And I think, well, they do, because they're writing it down and they're very eloquent about it. And especially if these are tomorrow's employees, it'd be good to wrap your head around those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a very revealing book if you're interested in young people, and it's being turned into another book and a show and a podcast. So there's lots of things coming this year. So, but yeah, it's a really good starting point if you're interested in Gen Z.
Well, I think there ain't no choice. I think we've got to be interested in Gen Z because it's here, and
Agreed.
and I don't think we can be standoffish about any generation. I know that older generations look at the younger ones and go, oh, they don't know what it's like. They didn't win a war. Well, I don't know anybody. Well, I do actually, because Cyprus had wars after, but I don't know anybody from World War II. So I think there's many people now that don't know anybody that fought in a war.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a real boomer thing about the war, and it's like, well, you weren't there either, Farage or whatever it was. So get off your high horse, mate. So no, absolutely, yeah, I agree. Understanding younger generations helps you to really understand what's coming in the future, and it totally makes sense from an individual or a company.
Yeah,
completely.
And I don't think from an employer's point of view, I don't think it's making things easier or pandering to them. I think it's actually just understanding, and then, like you said, making things really clear. Here's what we expect from you, and maybe also emphasize ethos and the company vision a bit more, because like you said, that the Gen Z are more into that sort of thing, and if they see that, I might take a little bit of crap, but look at this great ethos, oh, it's great, I'm buying into that. Maybe that's the what we need to be doing more so as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that kind of wholesale invested approach, it absolutely makes sense. And people need some help. I do lots of stuff about sort of training young people, so sort of drop us a line. But yeah, it's I think an investment now, I think definitely pays off later.
Yeah, I'm going to put a link to your book. I'm going to put a link to your website, and I do encourage everybody to sort of look and read, and maybe get in touch if they need to. That would be great if you allow that.
Awesome,
fantastic.
Please do. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I will let you go. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely weekend.
You too.
Bye.